Kitty Cat Kids Corner. Kitty Cat Kids Corner. Kitty Cat Kids Corner. It's Saturday story time. Welcome to a special edition of Kitty Cat Kids Corner Saturday Story Time. We are celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which granted many women the right to vote. Check out the links in the video description to learn more about women's suffrage. Votes for Women was the official campaign slogan for the women's suffrage movement. Cool cat facts. Did you know that the cat was the symbol of the women's suffrage movement? Suffrage means the right to vote. The color gold, or sunflower yellow, was adopted as the Votes for Women color in 1867. In the early 1900s, when women were campaigning for voting rights, cats were often used to portray them in anti-suffrage political cartoons. Cats were considered simple, delicate, and passive, and they were used to represent women in a negative way by people who did not want women to vote. In 1916, suffragists, or women who fought for the vote, turned cats into a positive representation of women. A black cat with a gold ribbon collar became the unofficial mascot of two suffragists who traveled across America to campaign for votes for women in 1916. Saxon the Suffrage Cat will not give up until women have full suffrage in every state. How many states does he still need to win? Here's a hint. Take a look at the map key. Stay tuned to find out the answer at the end of today's story time. Hello! Welcome back to the Kitty Cat Kids Corner for a very special edition of Saturday Story Time. August is Women's Suffrage Month. This year we are celebrating the 100-year anniversary of women's right to vote in the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Today, Lorenzo and I will be reading a story called Saxon the Suffrage Cat, Grand Texas Adventure, written by me. In May of 1916, two traveling suffragists named Alice Burke and Nell Richardson and a black kitten arrived in Beaumont, Texas by way of automobile. After days of driving, the suffragists and kitten were accustomed to the dips and bumps of dusty roads carved out of the southern soil, but they were not used to the Texas heat. The traveling trio were 3 days shy of a month into their road trip to rally people around the country for the cause of women's suffrage. The black kitten, named Saxon after the automobile manufacturer that supplied the suffragists with their vehicle, joined the Votes for Women adventure just 3 weeks prior in Mobile, Alabama. Enchanted by the blossoming orange groves, pecan orchards, and huge live oaks of Alabama, Alice and Nell were pleased to see that support for women's suffrage flourished just as beautifully in their traditional tucked-away towns of the South as it did in parts of the Midwest. Everywhere Alice and Nell traveled, townsfolk rushed upon them, excited by a spectacle such as two women and a kitten driving a golden car. People showered them with gifts and words of encouragement, and a mobile man gave Alice and Nell a teeny, tiny, black kitten. The kitten fit into the palms of his hand. Alice gladly accepted the creature and exclaimed that it was the most interesting gift they had received yet. Saxon was soft and well-tempered and traveled easily with the suffragists. While the women drove, Saxon stayed tucked away in a special wicker basket stuffed with a soft cotton blanket. Placed between Alice and Nell on the front car seat, the rough purr of the Golden Flyer's engine and the constant rocking caused by the earthen roads were comforting to Saxon and reminded him of his mother's care. Alice and Nell made sure Saxon ate regularly and drank plenty of water every time they pulled over for a driving break. When the Golden Flyer broke down in Beaumont, Texas, the suffragists brought Saxon along with them on their adventures around town and even fashioned a yellow ribbon into a collar for his tiny neck. The yellow gold color represented votes for women. Nell tucked Saxon into the crook of her arm as they drove to Port Arthur, where they were greeted by a friendly crowd of oilmen. Saxon was transfixed by the oil refineries they sped by on their way to visit Spindletop, where the first Texas oil was discovered years before. When the trio arrived in Houston, the suffragists checked into a fancy hotel that had elevators. When the bellboy welcomed them into the strange contraption, the suffragists kept Saxon hidden in his basket and hoped he wouldn't mule. Saxon's full belly kept him quiet, but his stomach dropped as the elevator jerked and loudly ascended to their room. Saxon was only 2 months old, but he had the appetite of a lion. He briefly regretted consuming so much goat milk and shredded chicken at their last roadside stop. While staying in Houston, the suffrage trio visited the port city of Galveston to give a speech on women's voting rights. Although the suffragists sometimes thought it best to leave little Saxon in their hotel room while they attended parades and speaking events, the crowds expected to see him now. Saxon quickly became the unofficial mascot of Votes for Women. The sun beat down on the Galveston crowd and blistered Alice's nose as she spoke on suffrage from her golden podium. Saxon mewled and wiggled around in his basket. He felt very warm, but the two suffragists made sure he was kept safely out of the sun and cooled off with plenty of water. At the end of their speech, they gently removed Saxon from his basket, fixed his yellow ribbon collar, and hoisted him up for all to see. The crowds of suffrage supporters cheered and took turns petting him. They called him Saxon the Suffrage Cat. On the way to Dallas, the trio passed army troops mobilizing outside of San Antonio and felt relieved when they were finally out of sight. The trio drove through dusty roads buffered by fields of white poppies and, on occasion, Nell would hold Saxon up to see the birds and butterflies. She laughed when his kitten eyes went as wide as saucers. The trio stopped for fuel and water in Waco, and the suffragists admired miles of cultivated land. The Texas heat was unbearable, and there wasn't much shade in Waco, but the Golden Flyer needed a break, too. Once they reached Dallas, the trio felt relieved. Saxon was suffering just as much as the suffragists, driving for hours along dusty roads under the Texas sun. Alice and Nell would often pull back Saxon's blanket to get a glimpse of his little pink nose and whiskers to make sure he was okay. In Dallas, the suffrage trio attended mass conventions and sparkling dinner parties where Saxon the Suffrage Cat was talked about just as much as Texas women being on the verge of securing voting rights. The next major stop was El Paso, but the trio was thrown off schedule when the Golden Flyer broke down in Mineral Wells, Texas. After repairs, the three hurried along through Colorado, Texas, Odessa, and Alpine. This leg of their journey was treacherous, and poor little Saxon was worn from the heat and hours on the rough and dusty roads. Saxon heard Alice and Nell speak of a Mexican Revolution and danger at the border. Saxon wasn't sure what this meant, but even as a very young cat, He could sense that Alice and Nell, the two bravest women in the world, were scared. The suffrage trio braved onwards and drove through thick clouds of rock soot and were lost in the desert for 2 whole days. Nell was nervous about poor little Saxon in the Texas heat. She could tell he felt unwell. Nell dipped his cotton blanket in cool water and kept him wrapped up until they finally reached El Paso. El Paso was cosmopolitan, and the suffrage trio found hotel lodgings just as fancy as the one in Houston. Saxon and the suffragists held votes for women rallies in the public park and were met with enthusiastic support for women's suffrage. Saxon could tell that his suffragists were pleased and hopeful for women's suffrage in Texas. Later that night, Alice sat at the small table in their hotel room and set up her typewriter, one of the many necessities the suffragists packed for their trip across America. Alice reflected on their grand Texas adventure. They had been on the road for more than a month now, but that time was little in comparison to the decades women had fought for voting rights and equal citizenship under the law. Saxon was in her lap, purring, happy to be under the roof of their lodgings and sheltered from the hot wind and dust. Their trip across Texas was long and full of calamity. They had experienced more excitement and uncertainty in one state than in the entire East Coast. But the suffragists thought fondly of Texas. The people were friendly and, to their pleasure, welcomed the gospel of women's suffrage. Saxon the Suffrage Cat was received warmly by Texans as well. The little black cat had managed to pull through the most harrowing of experiences in the Texas deserts and border towns. Alice looked at the tiny cat, adorned with the yellow ribbon collar, and was grateful for the excitement he added to their campaign for women's voting rights. He was one tough kitten, and as the new unofficial mascot of the women's suffrage campaign, he would need to be. If Saxon and the suffragists could survive Texas, they could survive anything, even anti-suffragists. Thank you for joining me for this special edition of Catterday Storytime. I hope you enjoyed my story about Saxon the Suffrage Cat, and I hope you'll go onto the library website and search our catalog for more about Saxon the Suffrage Cat. Saxon the Suffrage Cat will not give up until women have full suffrage in every state. How many states does he still need to win? If you counted 42 states, you are correct. The easiest way to find the answer is to locate the states that had full suffrage and subtract them from the rest. Some states granted women full voting rights before the 19th Amendment became law. To learn more about the two suffragists Saxon traveled with, check out the book Around America to Win the Vote, Two Suffragists, a Kitten, and 10,000 Miles by Mara Rockcliffe, illustrated by Hadley Hooper. View this Suffrage Centennial Catterday Storytime on our YouTube channel, LSC Sci-Fair Library, via the playlist Kitty Cat Kids Corner, Catterday Storytime and Crafts, to view source links in the description box. If you enjoyed this Catterday Storytime, be sure to check out our Cats 101 LibGuide and Catterday Storytime webpage for more Catterday stories. Follow us on Facebook and YouTube to check out our weekday story times with our talented children's librarians and specialists. Happy Catterday!